Welcome to another episode of I'll Allow It Nevada from the Supreme Court of Nevada Administrative Office of the Courts. I'm Anne-Marie Mailloux from the Judicial Education Unit, your host. And this episode is the 2022 Nevada State Criminal Opinions Update, presented by our Nevada Court of Appeals staff attorney, Dan Slimek. Welcome, Dan.
Hello, my name is Dan Slimek. I am a staff attorney in the Criminal Division of the Court of Appeals, and I'm here to do a CLE on the criminal opinions that the appellate courts issued in 2022. If you listen to me before, I normally say this isn't a super in-depth or exhaustive discussion of each opinion. It's just a bit of a brief overview of what the opinions say. And then if in the months ahead you're working on a case that had something come out recently, that maybe your memory will be jogged that you heard something and you can go find it and deal with it with the way that the appellate courts have recently dealt with it. Anyway, with that, I'll get going. And the first case is Dean versus Sheriff. And this appeal stems from a district court's denial of a post-conviction petition for a writ of habeas corpus. Dean was convicted pursuant to a jury verdict of attempted murder with the use of a deadly weapon, battery with the use of a deadly weapon, and battery with the use of a deadly weapon resulting in substantial bodily harm. During jury selection, Dean's trial counsel questioned jurors concerning offensive racial stereotypes. Counsel's questions were posed in a careless and offensive manner. In response to counsel's questions, a juror rejected counsel's suggestions regarding race and asserted that everyone is equal and that it was unfair to make assumptions based on a person's race. None of the jurors agreed with counsel's suggestions regarding racial stereotypes, but counsel persisted in posing questions regarding that issue, and even asked if the jurors believed that Dean had a propensity for violence due to his race. Dean was ultimately convicted and subsequently filed a post-conviction petition. The district court conducted an evidentiary hearing and heard testimony regarding counsel's questioning of the jurors. At the evidentiary hearing, counsel testified that he sought to bring out unconscious racial bias that counsel believed to be present in everyone. Following the evidentiary hearing, the district court denied Dean's petition. On appeal, the Supreme Court concluded that the manner in which counsel questioned jurors concerning race constituted deficient performance and that Dean was prejudiced by counsel's error. The Supreme Court noted that counsel's goal of addressing racial bias does not mean that the method in which counsel chose to reach that goal was reasonable. The Supreme Court also explained that bringing such racial invective into the courtroom cannot be justified, and that it did not believe there to be a reasonable basis for counsel's method of exploring racial bias. In addition, counsel's introduction of offensive racial stereotypes undermined the court's confidence in the outcome of the trial. The Supreme Court also concluded that the nature of counsel's questioning concerning racial stereotypes warranted action by the trial court, and the Supreme Court urged trial judges to exercise reasonable control when counsel exceeds the bounds of reasonable questioning during jury selection. Next is Anselmo versus State, and this appeal stems from a district court's denial of a post-conviction petition for genetic marker analysis. Anselmo was convicted of first-degree murder in 1972. A woman was raped and murdered, and Anselmo reported to the police that he had discovered the victim's body, and he also told the police that he knew where to locate the victim's jacket and keys. Anselmo asserted that another person had killed the victim, and they had only helped to discard her belongings because he was threatened by that person. However, during a later discussion, Anselmo confessed to committing the crime, but at trial, he argued that his confession was not consistent with the crime and reiterated that the other person had committed the killing. Anselmo was convicted after trial and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2018, Anselmo filed a petition requesting genetic marker analysis for DNA evidence using a procedure that was not available at the time of his trial. The district court denied the petition, finding that Anselmo failed to show a reasonable possibility that the state would not have tried him or that the jury would not have convicted him had he obtained favorable evidence from the DNA test results. However, the Nevada Supreme Court concluded that the district court erred by denying the petition. The court explained that NRS 176.09183 subsection 1 requires the reviewing district court to assume that the requested DNA marker analysis will produce exculpatory evidence, and the court must order DNA analysis if a reasonable possibility exists that the petitioner would not have been tried or convicted had exculpatory results been obtained before trial. In Anselmo's trial, the state relied upon a felony murder theory based upon rape, and if testing of DNA evidence excluded Anselmo as the perpetrator, he would not have been prosecuted or convicted. In addition, the state should have provided a detailed inventory of the evidence in its possession so that the district court may ascertain which pieces of evidence should be tested. Next is in re application of Smith. This is a state's appeal from an order of the district court granting a post-conviction petition for a writ of habeas corpus. Smith was serving a prison sentence of life with a possibility of parole after 10 years. Smith was placed onto parole, but was subsequently arrested for the commission of a new crime and was detained in the county jail. The parole board found probable cause that Smith violated the terms of his parole and returned Smith to the custody of the Nevada Department of Corrections. Smith's parole hearing was continued for over a year, but the parole board eventually found that he violated his parole terms. Smith filed a petition arguing that his detention prior to the parole revocation hearing violated NRS 213.1517 because that statute did not permit him to be detained for more than 60 days prior to the revocation hearing. The district court found that Smith was entitled to relief and ordered the NDOC to apply the extra days Smith had spent in confinement as credit towards his sentence. The Nevada Supreme Court affirmed the district court's order. The Supreme Court noted that there is an exception to the 60-day rule, as NRS 213.1517 subsection 4 states that if probable cause for continued detention of a paroled prisoner is based on conduct which is the subject of a new criminal charge, the board may defer consideration of the prisoner's case until not more than 60 days after his return to the Department of Corrections custody, following the final adjudication of a new criminal charge. The Nevada Supreme Court concluded that the exception contained within NRS 213.1517 subsection 4 did not apply to Smith's situation. The court explained that the exception within that statute applies only when the parolee is returned to the Department of Corrections custody following the final adjudication of a criminal charge, and is not applicable when a parolee is returned to the department's custody before adjudication on the new charge. And here, Smith was returned to the Department of Corrections custody prior to the adjudication of his new charge. Next is Brass versus State, and this is an appeal from a judgment of conviction. Brass was convicted of numerous offenses involving the sexual abuse of a child. Brass had retained counsel, and on the eve of trial, Brass moved for the substitution of counsel due to counsel's failure to adequately prepare for trial. The district court conducted a hearing concerning Brass's motion, and a defense investigator testified concerning shortcomings in counsel's trial preparation. Counsel also conceded at the hearing that he did not adequately prepare for the trial. However, the district court denied Brass's request for substitution of counsel because Brass should have raised his concerns with counsel at an earlier time. The state would suffer prejudice, and the issues Brass raised boiled down to potential differences in trial strategy. But on appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court concluded that the district court abused its discretion by denying Brass's motion. The Nevada Supreme Court explained that there are different tests that a district court must apply when a defense counsel is appointed versus when a defense counsel is retained. Here, Brass's counsel was retained, and in such a situation, the Supreme Court noted that a defendant may substitute retained counsel at any time unless the motion to substitute is untimely and would result in the unreasonable disruption of the orderly process of justice. With a retained defense counsel, the defendant need not show that there was inadequate representation, or that there was an irreconcilable conflict in order to substitute counsel. Whereas the test for the substitution of appointed counsel focuses on the extent of the conflict between the client and counsel, the adequacy of the district court's inquiry into potential conflict between the client and counsel, and the timeliness of a motion for the substitution of counsel. The Supreme Court explained that the district court improperly utilized a standard that is suited for the substitution of appointed counsel, but should have instead used the standard for retained counsel. The court also found that Brass's request for substitution of counsel was timely given the circumstances in this matter, and any disruption in the orderly process of justice was reasonable. Therefore, that the Supreme Court reversed and remanded for a new trial. Next is Barlow versus State, and this is an appeal from a judgment of conviction. Barlow was convicted of multiple offenses, including first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. Before the penalty phase, the district court prohibited Barlow from arguing that if a single juror concluded that mitigating circumstances outweigh the aggravating circumstances, then the jury can no longer consider the death penalty and must impose a lesser sentence. The district court did so because it concluded that such a result amounted to a hung jury. However, the Nevada Supreme Court clarified that such a situation did not amount to a hung jury. Rather, a hung jury occurs during the penalty phase only when the jury cannot unanimously agree on the sentence to be imposed. When the jury cannot reach a unanimous decision on the weighing of the aggravating and mitigating factors, the jury cannot impose death, but must consider the other sentences that may be imposed. And the Supreme Court specifically stated that even if one juror determines that there are mitigating circumstances sufficient to outweigh the aggravating circumstances, the death penalty is no longer an option, and the jury may then consider whether to impose a lesser sentence. The district court therefore erred in precluding Barlow from making argument concerning that issue. The cumulative effect of that error and the additional errors made during the penalty phase meant that Barlow was entitled to a new penalty hearing. Next is Bennett versus State, and this is an opinion stemming from the district court's denial of a petition to establish factual innocence. Bennett was convicted of first-degree murder for shooting and killing the victim. Bennett and others were accused of shooting and killing a victim in retaliation for an otherwise unrelated murder. A witness testified at trial that she viewed the shooting and identified Bennett as one of the shooters. Years later, Bennett filed a petition to establish factual innocence. His petition was based upon the witness's recantation of her trial testimony that identified Bennett as the shooter. And it was also based upon an affidavit from another witness asserting that Bennett was not the shooter. The district court denied the petition without conducting an evidentiary hearing. And on appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court clarified that pursuant to NRS 34.960, subsection 2b, a petition may rely on a witness's recantation of trial testimony as newly discovered evidence, provided the recantation is not the only newly discovered evidence identified in the petition. The Supreme Court also explained that a petition may rely on newly discovered evidence that conflicts with a trial witness's testimony, provided the newly discovered evidence is substantive and exculpatory and not merely impeachment evidence. Finally, in deciding whether to conduct an evidentiary hearing after considering the pleadings, the district court must assume that the newly discovered evidence is credible. In this matter, Bennett's new evidence was sufficient to warrant an evidentiary hearing, and the Supreme Court concluded that the district court erred by declining to conduct such a hearing. Therefore, the Nevada Supreme Court reversed the district court's order and remanded for the district court to conduct an evidentiary hearing. Next is Nevada versus State, and this opinion stems from a judgment of conviction entered pursuant to a guilty plea of reckless driving resulting in substantial bodily harm. Nied caused a traffic accident. The victim in this matter was seriously injured and incurred substantial medical bills. The pre-sentence investigation report recommended imposition of restitution for the victim's medical bills and contained a summary of the bills that were submitted by the medical providers. However, the summary did not contain receipts or amounts that were actually paid to the medical providers. The victim also attempted to commit suicide following the accident and sought restitution for the medical expenses related to the suicide attempt. At the sentencing hearing, the victim's mother produced a document that showed that the victim's insurance company had paid more than $87,000 in medical bills and that the additional amounts were written off. Over Nied's objection, the district court imposed a restitution of more than $400,000 based upon the bills submitted by the providers. First, the Nevada Supreme Court concluded that Nied did not demonstrate that restitution related to the victim's suicide attempt was improper given the circumstances in this matter. Second, the court concluded that it was appropriate for imposition of restitution for amounts paid by the victim's insurance provider and not paid directly by the victim. Third, the court concluded that the restitution for medical costs should be based on amounts actually paid by the insurance provider and not the amounts billed by the medical providers. Fourth, the court concluded that the restitution amount should be offset by amounts paid by Nied's insurance company. The Supreme Court therefore reversed the judgment and remanded for a new sentencing hearing to reconsider restitution. Next is Senna versus State, and this opinion stems from a judgment of conviction of multiple offenses involving the long-term sexual abuse of children. Senna sexually abused many children, including his own. One victim reported the abuse when she was 24, and Senna was ultimately convicted of 95 offenses. On appeal, Senna first argued that the statute of limitations barred the prosecution of many of his charges. The Supreme Court concluded that the statute of limitations was tolled because Senna committed the offenses in a secret manner, and the statute of limitations did not begin to run until they were discovered. The Supreme Court adopted a definition for discovery of secret offenses and explained that a crime can remain undiscovered for tolling purposes if a person with knowledge of the offenses does not report it out of fear induced by threats made by the wrongdoer and other participants in the crime, or if the person is a child victim that did not report the crime until later. In this matter, the Nevada Supreme Court concluded that a victim's silence until she was 24 years of age was induced by threats made by Senna against her and her brothers, and therefore she did not legally discover those crimes until she was able to flee Senna's home. Next, the Supreme Court reviewed the unit of prosecution for incest. It reviewed whether each act should be its own charge or whether it should be charged per victim. The court concluded that the relevant statute was ambiguous. It also found that case law, legislative history, and public policy arguments did not provide clear guidance. Therefore, it applied the rule of lenity and found that the unit of prosecution should be victim and not act. The court accordingly vacated 4 of Senna's incest convictions. The court also concluded that some of Senna's child pornography and child abuse convictions were redundant, and it vacated the redundant convictions. Next is Thomas versus State, and this is an appeal from a district court order denying a post-conviction petition for a writ of habeas corpus. Thomas was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. During the proceedings for his first post-conviction petition, he obtained relief and was awarded a new penalty hearing. He was again sentenced to death. He filed a second post-conviction petition, but was not successful. He filed a third post-conviction petition and asserted that his post-conviction counsel for both his first and his second petition were ineffective. Initially, the Nevada Supreme Court noted that Thomas explained how the penalty phase counsel provided ineffective assistance, but it stated that he made only a bare assertion regarding his post-conviction counsel's ineffectiveness. And the court reiterated that NRS Chapter 34 requires a petitioner to specifically identify the procedural bars for each claim and explain how the petitioner has good cause for each claim. And if a petitioner is pleading that ineffective assistance of counsel provides good cause, the petitioner must specifically address the ineffective assistance of counsel claim and not do so in a perfunctory or conclusory manner. The Nevada Supreme Court concluded that Thomas did not timely raise claims stemming from his first post-conviction petition because they were raised more than 1 year after they became available. However, it found that Thomas timely raised claims of ineffective assistance of post-conviction counsel for issues stemming from the second penalty hearing. The Supreme Court found that the district court should have conducted an evidentiary hearing concerning post-conviction counsel's failure to present evidence in support of Thomas's claim concerning mitigation evidence and the jury selection for the second penalty hearing. Next is Guidry versus State, and this is an appeal from a judgment of conviction entered pursuant to a jury verdict of second-degree murder, robbery, grand larceny, and leaving the scene of an accident that resulted in bodily injury. Guidry stole a man's expensive watch. The man noticed Guidry attempting to drive away from the scene in her vehicle, and he jumped onto the vehicle's hood. The man punched the windshield, and Guidry caused the vehicle to accelerate. The man fell from the vehicle and hit his head. He subsequently died due to his injuries. During trial, the district court instructed the jury regarding second-degree felony murder, but the instruction was inaccurate. The state did not pursue a theory of second-degree murder, felony murder, and conceded on appeal that could not have pursued such a theory given the facts of the offense. And on appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court noted that the trial court has a duty to accurately instruct the jury on relevant issues and also has a duty not to issue instructions concerning issues that are irrelevant, confusing, or relieve the jury from making findings on a relevant issue. Here, the district court instructed the jury on an issue that was irrelevant to the proceedings. Moreover, the instruction on second-degree felony murder was inaccurate, and it also worked to relieve the jury of making a finding regarding whether Guidry acted with malice aforethought. The Nevada Supreme Court therefore reversed the second-degree murder conviction and remanded for further proceedings in light of the opinion. Next is Brown versus State, and this is an appeal from a judgment of conviction entered pursuant to a jury verdict of conspiracy to commit robbery, robbery with the use of a deadly weapon, and murder with the use of a deadly weapon. Brown was also convicted pursuant to an altered plea of ownership or possession of a firearm by a prohibited person. A person was shot and killed outside of an apartment complex in Las Vegas. Officers discovered the victim's body lying in a pool of blood between two cars. Bloody shoe prints led away from the body. During the investigation, officers learned that a cell phone discovered near the crime scene belonged to Brown. A subsequent search of Brown's home revealed a vehicle matched the description of one viewed near the crime scene, and shoes that appeared to have prints that matched those discovered near the victim's body. DNA testing also linked Brown to the murder. The trial court admitted evidence regarding shoe impressions. The state did not present expert testimony concerning these shoe impressions, but rather urged the jury to compare the impressions to Brown's shoes during its deliberations. On appeal, Brown argued that it was error for the trial court to admit shoe impression evidence without accompanying expert testimony. The Nevada Supreme Court concluded that expert testimony is not required to admit shoe impression evidence, and the jurors may make personal observations and draw general inferences concerning such evidence. In addition, the state hired a private company to obtain information from Brown's cell phone and sought to present that evidence at trial. The private company used proprietary technology to obtain the information from Brown's phone, and the trial court ruled that such information did not have to be disclosed to the jury. The trial court also permitted the representative from the company to testify remotely via audio-video technology. On appeal, Brown argued that the limits on questioning concerning the proprietary technology and the representative's remote testimony violated the Confrontation Clause. The Nevada Supreme Court concluded that the trial court did not make proper findings concerning the appropriateness of remote testimony, but that the error was harmless. In addition, the Nevada Supreme Court found that Brown did not demonstrate that limits on questions concerning trade secrets violated the Confrontation Clause. The court therefore affirmed the judgment of conviction. Of note, there is a concurring opinion in which Justice Pickering provides additional information regarding admissibility of shoe imprint impressions. The concurrence includes photographs depicting the relevant shoe and print. and explains that the shoe in question and the print are both clear and contain obvious distinctive features. Concurrence explains that admission of similar evidence should be limited to when the evidence in question contains unusually obvious characteristics, and that this opinion should not open the door to situations where a jury would be asked to evaluate evidence without the aid of expert testimony when such evidence would be beyond its ability or knowledge to make an appropriate evaluation. In addition, the concurrence also explains that trial courts should review similar evidence to ascertain whether its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. And next is Locker versus State. And this opinion stems from a judgment of conviction entered pursuant to a guilty plea of possession of less than 14 grams of a Schedule I controlled substance. Locker entered into a guilty plea agreement, but the agreement did not discuss whether Locker would be granted a deferred judgment and placed into a treatment program. Locker subsequently filed an election to enter into a substance abuse program. However, the district court did not defer judgment, but instead imposed sentence, suspended the sentence, and placed Locker on probation. On appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court explained that when a defendant and the defendant's conviction satisfied the requirements for a deferred judgment, NRS 176.211, subsection 3A1 requires the district court to defer judgment where the defendant consents to the deferral. Because Locker satisfied the requirements and he consented to the deferral, the district court abused its discretion by declining to defer Locker's judgment. Next is State versus McCall, and this opinion stems from a district court order granting a motion to suppress evidence. A female resident of McCall's home was on probation, and her probationary terms permitted officers to search her residence. The woman's probation officer received a letter indicating that she had violated the terms of her probation and also stated that she was residing with an ex-felon who was McCall. The woman was arrested and officers subsequently searched the home. Officers conducted a protective sweep of the residence and noticed shotgun shells in McCall's bedroom. The officers subsequently obtained a search warrant for the resident and McCall's vehicle. The search revealed firearms and items used to create forged credit cards. McCall was arrested and charged with crimes stemming from the discovery of those items. McCall later filed a motion to suppress evidence and argued that the protective sweep of the residence was illegal. The district court conducted a hearing, and the officers testified that they routinely conduct protective sweeps of residences upon entry. The district court found that the protective sweep was not lawful because there was no arrest prior to the sweep and because the officers did not testify concerning specific articulable facts to show that a protective sweep was necessary due to danger at that residence. On appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court concluded that an arrest is not required prior to a protective sweep. However, the court also noted that to lawfully conduct a protective sweep, officers must be able to articulate facts that would cause a reasonably prudent officer to believe that the area to be swept harbors an individual who poses a danger to those at the scene. Therefore, the district court properly concluded that McCall was entitled to relief. However, the Supreme Court noted that the district court failed to identify the specific evidence that should be suppressed. Accordingly, the Supreme Court directed the district court to enter findings concerning which items were legally seized. Next is Johnston versus the 8th Judicial District Court, and this opinion stems from an original petition for a writ of mandamus. Johnston challenged the pre-trial release protocols. He was arrested for criminal activity and subsequent release on bail. He was again taken into custody for violation of conditions of his bail. During his time on bail, Johnston did not stay at his approved residence, and there were open bottles of alcohol at the place where he had been staying. Johnston argued that he committed merely technical and not substantive violations of his bail conditions, but the district court rejected that argument. Johnston was released onto house arrest, but was again taken into custody for violating his bail conditions. Johnson subsequently filed a petition challenging the pretrial release protocols. The Nevada Supreme Court concluded that many of Johnson's claims were moot, but that the issues were capable of repetition, yet evading review. The court therefore clarified that a criminal defendant is constitutionally entitled to a prompt hearing after being taken into custody from pretrial release, and the state bears the burden at that hearing of demonstrating probable cause. The court also stated that it did not recognize a distinction between technical or substantive violations. In addition, the district court is also required to make findings of fact on the record that each condition of pretrial release is the least restrictive means of ensuring public safety and the defendant's return to court. And here, the Nevada Supreme Court granted mandamus relief in order for the district court to enter an order concerning Johnston's custodial status. Next is Zalyal versus State. This opinion stems from a judgment of conviction entered pursuant to a guilty plea of attempted sexual assault. Zalyal committed delinquent acts when he was 14, but he was not charged until he was 21. The charges were brought in district court and resulted in a criminal conviction. On appeal, Zalyal contended that the district court did not have subject matter jurisdiction over this matter because he was a juvenile when he committed the delinquent acts. The Nevada Supreme Court agreed with Zalyal. A delinquent act is not a criminal act, and NRS Chapter 62B provides that juvenile courts have exclusive jurisdiction over delinquent acts. NRS Chapter 62B also provides a means to transfer the case to the district court when a juvenile is at least 16 years of age, but not yet 18 years old. The juvenile court loses jurisdiction when a juvenile turns 21 years old, and a district court lacks jurisdiction to consider the type of matters at issue in this case. In addition, the state argued that Zalyal waived his right to a direct appeal in the plea agreement, and thus his appeal was subject to dismissal. However, the Nevada Supreme Court noted that subject matter jurisdiction cannot be waived. Therefore, the court concluded that the state's argument lacked merit, and because the district court lacked jurisdiction to convict Zalyal, the court vacated the judgment of conviction. And next is State versus 8th Judicial District Court. This opinion stems from an original petition for a writ of mandamus and/or prohibition challenging a district court's order denying a motion to admit evidence of a prior conviction. Doan, the real party in interest, was charged with murder, and the state alleged that he committed the murder during the commission or attempted commission of sexual assault. Prior to trial, the state sought to admit Doan's prior conviction of sexual assault causing substantial bodily harm with the use of a deadly weapon. The district court denied the state's motion, finding that the facts of this matter did not support the state's theory that a sexual assault occurred during the commission of the murder. The Nevada Supreme Court reviewed and clarified when a prior conviction involving a sexual offense should be admitted pursuant to NRS 48.045, subsection 3. First, the court stated that NRS 48.045, subsection 3 is applicable whenever a criminal defendant is charged with a sexual offense, and the district court should consider only the charging document and not the facts or evidence underlying the charge in making its initial determination as to whether NRS 48.045, subsection 3 is implicated in the case. Second, the court reiterated that the district court must ensure that the procedural safeguards discussed in Franks versus State are followed before determining whether to admit evidence of a prior sexual offense under NRS 48.045, subsection 3. The procedural safeguards include consideration of whether the other sexual offense is relevant to the crime charged, whether the other sexual offense is proven by a preponderance of evidence, and whether the probative value of the evidence is not substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. In this matter, the Supreme Court concluded that the district court manifestly abused its discretion by looking beyond the charge faced by Doan and into the evidence surrounding the victim's murder. The Supreme Court also concluded that the district court erred by finding that the probative value of the evidence of Doan's prior conviction was substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. Therefore, the Supreme Court granted the state's petition for a writ of mandamus and issued an order directing the district court to vacate its decision to deny the state's request to admit Doan's prior conviction at trial. And that's all of the criminal opinions from 2022. Thank you for listening.
And thank you to Dan for presenting our episode 3, the 2022 Nevada State Criminal Opinions Update. Don't forget to submit a certificate of attendance for listening to this podcast to jepodcast@ndcourts.nd.gov. You can also send any episode topic ideas to that same email. I'll Allow It Nevada episodes will be available every third Friday. Please join us again next month for another episode of I'll Allow It Nevada.